Hello, everyone. I'm Brendan Lawton. I'm a assistant to the organizing team from last year's Point Sud conference, The Struggles for Democracy in the Global South. An important topic during the conference was how social movements in Africa dealt and are dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. And to get different perspectives from activists across the continent, we started this little YouTube interview series. And today we're continuing that. We're talking with Angela Chukunzira. And we're excited to hear more about the struggles that she's engaged with and how the past years of the pandemic have impacted the movement. So thank you very much for being here with us today.
Thank you, Brendan, for inviting me.
So I guess the first question is just, could you tell us about a movement, maybe just one that you are involved in and what the struggle is generally for?
So I happen to be involved with a movement called the Community Organizing Working Group. The acronym is actually COWG. And so the initial struggle was about popular education and food distribution, because those are the immediate issues at hand when the pandemic started in South Africa, in Johannesburg in March 2020. And so initially the struggle was about educating people about the risks of the pandemic, and also identifying the members of the community who are most vulnerable. And for me, that was the core of the movement work at the beginning, because that was the urgent work. It just happened to be like from activists who are mostly actively involved in previous struggles in South Africa. And I happened to be in Johannesburg at the time. So that's how I got involved with popular education and food distribution.
Mm-hmm. And so who would you say generally is part of this group, this movement in general that are helping organize food?
So it was actually people who were previously involved in previous struggles in South Africa, and it was mostly concentrated. It's mostly working class activists who are concentrated in the townships and informal settlements of Johannesburg. And so that you'll see like most of the activists involved are people who are members of the Landless People Movement, Tembelile Crisis Committee. These were issues of electricity, for example, in South Africa, issues of land, issues of unemployment. So people who were previously involved in the so-called new social movement of South Africa, which were the post-apartheid movements, okay, from post-94. And mostly these were people involved in, these were activists involved in struggles in the 2000s going forward. And that was when that's the majority of the movement. However, I was not even part of that class of activists because I'm actually from Kenya, okay, and I'm a student at the University of Johannesburg. So it's when I got into Johannesburg that the lockdown was announced. So because I'm an activist from Kenya as well, I was able to get involved because my supervisor was involved in this movement, because she has been active in South Africa and struggles even during the apartheid era into the post-94. So that's how I happened to be plugged into the movement.
Okay, so that was your first big experience with activism in South Africa then, and before it was mostly just in Kenya. Yeah. Okay, wow.
It's actually interesting because I was initially doing my research on WhatsApp and social movements in Kenya. And then that could not happen because of the constraints of the pandemic. And so the pandemic just made me to get heavily involved in South African social movements. And that's how I got introduced to them. And COWG was interesting because I didn't intend to do my research on COWG, for example. And I didn't even intend to work with South African movements that actively, but because of the constraints of the pandemic, I happened to be engaged with them, mm-hmm, and to actively work during the pandemic period, especially because when South Africa announced a lockdown, there were several lockdown levels. And okay, so lockdown level 5 was the highest lockdown level where movement was restricted. There was no sale of alcohol, no sale of cigarettes, no movement at all. And so this was when there was actually highest need of popular education to educate people why are we on this lockdown? Why is there need for food distribution or popular education at the very least? Right. It's very interesting how actually the technology is involved, because I was only involved in this movement because of technology, because mm-hmm, had to be socially distanced, and it was a movement that was operating, I would say, behind the scenes, because the organizing was happening online, yet the actual work was happening offline, distributing of food, distributing of pamphlets for popular education. So the fact that it was happening actually behind the scenes is a very different kind of activism. Is a kind of activism that I'm not used to. And I think that's the novelty of it, because we were working behind the scenes, and this could not have been possible not been working on Zoom. And I'll later talk about these challenges of like working class activists working online. The technology is different. We were actually operating almost entirely in terms of organizing from Zoom. And I found that very interesting, because it really meant a lot of work behind the scenes to be able to accomplish what was really actually needed at the height of the pandemic.
Yeah. Is there something that you successfully accomplished within the movement that you're particularly proud of, since I guess you've started in the past 2.5 years or so?
I think I'm particularly proud of the activists for the work that they did, partly because they were already activists and well known within their communities, right? So that gave them an added advantage, because people can trust them and they were able to be confident. And I realized that confidence is really a key in terms of convincing people of the need to have popular education. Because, trying to tell people in working class communities the importance of social distancing and not coming out of their yards at the height of the pandemic, when people were hungry, people were angry, it really took a lot of effort from the activists. And so I'm very proud of them that they could be able to accomplish that, one, and two, to be able to actually identify the most vulnerable members of their community, which is not an easy task, to be able to see that, yes, we have food parcels, but they're not enough to feed everybody. And so we need to be able to identify those who are most vulnerable. They're the priority to be able to give, because we could not serve everybody within the community. And for me, that was important, because people did not need to have an ID, for example, unlike other political parties that needed people to have an ID. And these are issues to do with, for example, xenophobia, excluding people, excluding foreigners, excluding other people who are unable to have documentation. And even, it's not just foreigners, even South African nationals, for example, who did not have IDs, could not be able to be given the food by other parties. But for CAUC, what was unique was overcoming all these issues and trying to identify the most vulnerable. I think that's what I'm most proud of CAUC. And even in the beginning of this year, continuing 2 years after the pandemic, they were able to mobilize against an anti-xenophobia march in Johannesburg, which I felt was a really, really large accomplishment for the group. They were able to include everybody, to include the most vulnerable at a time when the most vulnerable were really extremely vulnerable. I think that was a huge, huge accomplishment. And also another accomplishment for me, which I'm particularly proud of the members of CAUC, was the ability to organize online and offline. The odds were against them, because just being a working class activist in a working class community, sometimes there's the issue of electricity, the issue of not having access to data. And so this group particularly had middle class activists who were able to mobilize for resources. They had social capital, which was useful, because they were able to ask NGOs for food parcels, for instance, ask NGOs for money for data, which actually enabled the mobilization to be much more successful. Otherwise, I don't think it could have been as successful as it was.
So then what were some of the key challenges when you look at the last 2 years of this pandemic? What would you say? I mean, yeah, I think you've touched on some things, but it would be great to just hear, some of the largest challenges you faced.
I think a major challenge would have been to organize separately, organizing without being together. For me, that was new, because I've never done activism without physical meetings, without, so that having to be separate. And these were people who were organizing across Johannesburg, in separate townships, in separate informal settlements. And so being able to do that, I think was a very big challenge, because you needed to mobilize for data. You needed to mobilize for people to have smartphones. And you know that not all smartphones are created equally. Some smartphones cannot even have the application Zoom and WhatsApp at the same time.
Right.
And so having to operate that in tandem, for example, sending a Zoom link was being sent on a WhatsApp group for that to be able to work. So sometimes you can't have even pictures, and you can't have Zoom and WhatsApp in your smartphone at the same time. You have to keep deleting, and some smartphones are a challenge, yeah. And sometimes not having electricity, so not having access to be able to charge your device, to be able to participate in a meeting, because this meeting was well coordinated behind the scenes. So what it meant is that people are online, and then they're planning how will the food get to us? How will we talk to the Uber driver? Can you imagine? Like, it's a whole system behind the scenes, because there's an Uber driver involved who is delivering the food from Johannesburg, from central place in Johannesburg to other places of Gauteng, and they're not only delivering food, they're delivering personal protective equipment like gloves and masks and sanitizer, so that these people can be able to go to mobilize door to door within their communities, and they have to protect themselves at the same time, and to also be an example. It was almost like a uniform to have this PPE on, and to go door to door and tell them, this is what we need to do. This is why you need to stay in your yard, and trying to convince people even to close some of the bars, which are known as shebins in South Africa, so that people are not able to spread the virus by sitting together and drinking together. Mm-hmm. So it was a very difficult period. And I think just the major challenge is mobilizing online, which we managed somehow, because people were able to delete some of the applications on their smartphones, to somehow delete photos. And, it was operation with Zoom and WhatsApp in tandem, because you had to we were in the WhatsApp group as a team leader, as an activist, and then you're also attending Zoom meetings. So I think that was the biggest challenge, to be at the height of the lockdown. And then apart from organizing online, also trying to identify the most vulnerable in your communities, because everybody's feeling that they're vulnerable, and rightly so, because you're unable to go to work. And so when you're saying that this family is more vulnerable than the next, the criteria to use, and try to convince people that I think this family desires a food parcel, and this can hold for a bit. I think it's a challenge. Like, I would not imagine being an activist, and the empathy you naturally have. The activists really did well in that sense. Like, it was a huge challenge for them, and it was a very difficult period also for them themselves, also being out of work, and trying to operate within a very difficult period, within a period that there's so much uncertainty. You don't know, and you don't think, and the reality is that most of you will not go back to work even after the pandemic. Yeah.
Do you see some new opportunities being opened up now because of what's happened in the past 2 years? Or do you see like this kind of Zoom organizing in this hybrid way is kind of just here to stay? And I mean, these types of things kind of, or I guess it's like kind of the question.
That's a very challenging, that's a very challenging question for me, because I tend to think that the hybridization is the future. And I think it's going to be impossible to have a meeting without an online component to it going forward. There must be this hybridization, but new opportunities opening up because of what the pandemic has given us is, for example, an opportunity to talk about issues that we were previously ignoring, or maybe, let me say, were underlying issues that were not highlighted. For example, the issue of mental health was something that was not talked about. And I think the pandemic really forced us to talk about this issue. And when Arundhati Roy said the pandemic is a portal, for example, it's something, and also last week I attended a meeting and they were saying the pandemic is a battlefield, because it's a battlefield of ideas. And so what is happening on the left, for example, in the left organizing scene, the right is also organizing as well. And so issues such as mental health, and I could see my own, let me give myself as an example. Mental health, you have to deal with it. You have to confront it. And sometimes, unfortunately, some of us succumbed to it and were not able to recover. Depression, this alienation were issues that really were brought to the surface because of the pandemic. And I think that it's important that we have to integrate it even in workspaces, in schools, school-going children, universities. I think it has to be embraced more. And I think that is an opportunity for us to actually talk about these kind of issues that were brought about by the pandemic. And also things like holistic healing, food security, because people are talking about the lack of food. And so I saw during the pandemic, some places were starting food gardens, independent food gardens. People were having their own, having issues of self-reliance. My own movement in Kenya, one of our pillars is self-reliance, and we got inspiration from Ujamaa, which was inspired by Julius Nyerere. And so self-reliance, just having your own things, like you're building a community that is self-reliant, is very important. Food security and issues like, because we were also online for a long time, issues such as digital colonialism and digital rights came up a lot, and I think the pandemic has been a portal for these things. And I appreciate that these issues that were underlying and were not really highlighted were more pronounced during the pandemic. Issues like digital colonialism, which you need to talk about, actually. Issues like digital rights, when you have to accept cookies in every single site you go to, and yet you're online because you have to be online most of the time. So I'm grateful that the pandemic brought out these issues. And I think these are opportunities. And also, aside from these opportunities, also the fact that we had much more internalization of struggles. I remember in the height of the pandemic, was it in May or June, when there was the killing of George Floyd, and the Black Lives Matter movement emerged even much more profoundly. And there was solidarity around those issues. Even CAUG on June 16 of 2020 was very keen to have Black Lives Matter as part of the issues we were talking about. So the internationalization of struggle, and so food gardens, food security was not new. I've seen seasoned activists like Vandana Shiva, who's been talking about food security for a long, long time. And during the height of the pandemic, this was amplified. And so I'm grateful that some of these issues that, should have been organizing before have been amplified, especially during the pandemic.
And then I guess, as the last question is just, I guess you're still part of CAUG and everything, and what would you like to accomplish in the next year or so in the pandemic still, and with all this in mind?
As in, CAUG is actually shifting, and that is what is interesting for me, because it was about popular education and food distribution, and now they're looking about vaccine equality, where are people being excluded from vaccination because the sites are not being brought closer to the townships. And these are issues that CAUG has actually been actively able to organize around, to organize around, and bringing the vaccine to the people has been a very important thing, for example, because people do not have transport to go to the vaccine sites. And you can see it in some of the research that has been done by some of the activists and some of the academics in the movement, how the vaccines are more concentrated, for example, in Johannesburg within the suburban areas, unlike in the townships where the vaccines are not being brought close to the people. And they've actually managed to mobilize around this issue. And going forward, I think health issues that are arising within the townships will be more looked into because of what CAUG has managed to accomplish during the pandemic. And I think that is an accomplishment in one side, but it's also a continuation of struggle. It allows to be able to amplify some of the struggles of the township, some of the struggles that are happening in the more disadvantaged sides of Johannesburg.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks very much.
And in terms of
sorry.
movement, sorry.
No.
Going forward in my own movement, when I'm in Kenya, because I'm accountable to them, I think we need to have more issues of food security. And I think we've managed to partly look into that, and about holistic healing and looking into medicine, amplifying the issue of traditional medicine, traditional healing, as opposed to entirely Western-centric kind of medicine. And I think that is very, very important because holistic healing is a journey of going back to the land, is a journey of reclaiming our rights as not only as a people who are Black people, but also as reclaiming our traditions and our roots, right? and looking at healing in alternative ways, looking at healing in ways that have been neglected over time, and going back to the land, like looking at herbs instead of entirely pharmaceutical drugs that we're relying on, and they're making us even sicker with the side effects. We are also trying to look at a holistic healing, and that also links to the issue of food. And as I mentioned before, it links to the issue of land rights, access to land, access to be able to farm. And it also looks at trying to look for alternative ways, alternative methods of healing our bodies and health, because it also looks at mental health. We need to work together. The individualization will have to become community. We have to have solidarity within our communities.
Okay, thanks. This was a great time. Thanks a lot for telling us all about your movement and your ideas. I guess I can turn off the recording now. That was great. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Brendan. I really appreciate it, and I really appreciate that looking into other movements and involving me in this project. I'm grateful.